Thank you, Chairwoman Primavera and other members of the committee. Appreciate your attention in this afternoon, and I appreciate you inviting me to testify before you today. I'm here on behalf of Americans United for Life Action. Our vision at AUL is a nation where every person is welcomed in life and protected in law. And that's why I'm so pleased to testify on behalf of HB 1112, because we believe that this bill will advance that vision here in Colorado with the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. HB 1112 will protect some of Colorado's most vulnerable citizens, babies who are born under difficult and even dangerous circumstances. This bill requires medical professionals to provide nourishment and, quote, medically appropriate and reasonable medical care and treatment or surgical care, just what we've just been talking about, to every infant born alive, regardless of his or her stage of gestational development. And I want to just underscore something that was said quite a bit earlier in being very clear that this bill does not in any way infringe on a woman's decision to terminate her pregnancy. However, the bill does apply when the infant is born, and the Act specifically provides that those protections extend to those children. And I would just note as a personal side note that I do have a friend who was born alive through a failed abortion, and her life is extremely valuable to a lot of people. And later in this panel, you'll hear from Sarah, who's here in person today, who was also born under those circumstances. So though it may not be a situation that makes headlines or happens every day, there are people that we all know and cherish and who are alive today who need the protection that this bill provides. We've also had a fair amount of testimony about the federal Born Alive Infant Protection Act that was passed in 2002, and I will try not to repeat things that have already been said, but there were a few points that I wanted to make about that. Americans United for Life every January releases something called the Life List. Because we do work with state legislatures all across the country, we rank states according to how pro-life their laws are. This year, and actually for several years, the state that ranked at the very bottom of our list is the state of Washington. And the state of Washington has passed a bill that is similar to this one. So I would urge you as legislators of the great state of Colorado to join the other 30 states across this country in passing what is a really common sense piece of legislation that most Americans think should are puzzled when they hear that there's any debate about it whatsoever. In terms of why we need this law here in Colorado when there's already a federal bill, 2 points that I would want to make that I don't, or 3, that I don't believe have been fully worked out. One is that the federal law only applies to hospitals and doctors and clinics that are federally funded. So what that means is that private clinics and doctors who are in private practice are not covered by the federal bill. And so here in Colorado, specifically, you, on your laws, you have no limitations on late-term abortions. And obviously those are the abortions that we're most concerned with here. And so Colorado is a kind of a destination place for late-term abortions. And so we believe that it's particularly important that the private clinics where these late-term abortions are usually performed have some kind of law that applies directly to them, because it requires having a state law in order to empower state law enforcement, and that goes to the discussion that we just had previously. So I'll stop there, but I do want to thank you very much, Chairwoman Primavera. I appreciate your emphasis on respectfulness. I think this has been a very good hearing, and I appreciate your attention to this matter.
Thank you. And can I just ask what kind of doctor you are? Are you a doctor in theology?
I'm a PhD in American government.
Okay. Are there any questions for Dr. Yoest? Representative Conti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Yoest, we heard previously from an attorney that there are already sufficient laws on the Colorado books, Colorado-specific books, that would cover this and make this a moot point. Where, in your legal opinion, or maybe someone who's coming later would be better qualified to answer this, do you feel that would your legal prowess disagree with his?
Well, I think, thank you. I think that in an ideal world, in my ideal situation, it would be really obvious that a baby born in an abortion situation was protected by law. But I think given the fact that we do know of situations where that is not occurring, that's why we see the need for this kind of legislation. And even the specificity that's in this bill goes to the need for the bill. You were asking about, Representative Winholtz, about the language about what is born and not born. To me, it's a little bit sad that we have to have that conversation, but sometimes there's arguments made that if you still have the umbilical cord, you're not fully born, that kind of thing. So that's why we need this legislation, is because abortion does unfortunately put us in a slightly gray area. Although I would argue and just ask that in terms of, I have a lot of friends who disagree with me on this issue, abortion in general. But I do think that on this issue, this is something that offers an opportunity for us to come together in common ground.
Representative Everett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kind of a general question. Obviously, you've had a lot of experience and obviously been to other states and stuff and dealt with this bill. So in other states where similar legislation has been proposed, have there been organizations that are generally in favor of abortion? Have they come out and supported this bill or been against it, or what have you seen?
Yoest?
I thought it was really very interesting. I listened very carefully to the testimony from the representative from Planned Parenthood of Colorado, because I did testify on behalf of a similar bill like this in Florida, and Planned Parenthood of Florida actually ended up supporting the bill. They ended up changing their opinion halfway through the debate, but that bill was passed unanimously in the Florida legislature.
Representative Joshi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Yoest. As you read this bill, do you see, does it apply to average physician or doctors?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question, because it does apply to any situation where a baby is born, although this is specifically delineated to be in the abortion context. So we're going to hear from another physician later in this panel. The bill is written very carefully so that it does not apply to a doctor outside the context of abortion. And honestly, our experience has been that this question of what is medically appropriate to save a baby that is born on the line of viability or in an emergency situation is not that confusing.
The Representative Joshi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so can you go in a little bit more detail in that terminology of the medically appropriate and reasonable care? Can you?
Well, in fact,
Yoest?
I'm sorry, I keep stepping on
All right, people are listening. Not that they can't tell your voice from or Representative Joshi's, but we just need to.
I apologize. In fact, it's specific in the bill that there is not a requirement to save a baby that is dying, and that so it's deliberately crafted to be within the confines of what I've tragically heard referred to as an accidental birth, where an abortionist is not expecting to have a live baby.
Representative Windholtz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excuse me. A lot of times you've heard the term extraordinary measures at the beginning of life or the end of life to save a life. Or would a doctor be in jeopardy of a lawsuit in that, or charged with murder, if this would have taken extraordinary measures to save that child, or just ordinary, as normal procedures when a child is born early?
Dr. Yoest.
I think you and I were afflicted by the same bug. This is why the language is really careful to say medically appropriate and reasonable medical care, in order to avoid those kinds of challenges.
All right, I have a couple of questions. You mentioned that the federal law doesn't cover private hospitals. I don't know how many private hospitals that we have in Colorado that aren't owned by the Sisters of Charity. I think they own quite a few of them. Their policy doesn't allow them to provide abortion services, does it? Do you know?
I can't speak to that, but like you, I would guess not.
And then on your life list, where does Colorado fall on that? And can you explain a little bit more what that is?
Sorry, I'm looking to someone who's
Your
a
lifeline?
lot of knowledge. Yes, my lifeline. Thank you. He's saying 36th.
Representative Melton?
We'd love to come back and help you with that.
Oh, unless you wanted to.
Oh, go ahead, Representative Melton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry, I just heard you say something about the language is crafted so that way if a fetus or infant is dying, that they, there's nothing in there that would say that they have to be saved, but I'm not seeing that. In fact, I'm seeing on page 7 under, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this term, infanticide, that basically is saying that if you fail to provide any kind of medically appropriate, reasonable care, that you'd be in danger of that. So I'm not seeing where you're seeing that in the bill.
Ms. Yoest?
Look on page, well, I don't know if everybody has the same page. It would be in the bill summary. It says, a person is prohibited from depriving an infant of medically appropriate and reasonable medical care unless the medical care, skipping down to the third bullet, is treatment that will do no more than temporarily prolong the act of dying when death is imminent. So that language is meant to underscore the language about medically appropriate and reasonable.
Representative Melton?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I think that's the problem that I'm having right now is the definition around appropriate and reasonable. I definitely understand prolonging but technically I could try to prolong someone till they're 18 or really try to keep them going, especially given that earlier in the bill it's giving definitions as to what alive is, which is heartbeat, one or more of the following: breathing, a heartbeat, umbilical cord pulsation, or definite movement of voluntary muscles. So, I mean, this seems very broad to me. I'm not sure if you're seeing that broadness or not.
Dr. Yoest?
Well, I think that I think it's a sad thing that we need to define what being born alive is. But the fact that there are people that we know and love today that had to be saved in a situation where the doctor who was performing the abortion was unwilling to do so is an indication that legislation like this is necessary.
Representative Melton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one last thing, talking about necessary legislation. Since this is already, the federal government's dealt with this. We have numerous laws around this, kind of going back to page 8 and talking about the civil action. This seems like it would lead to just kind of harassing lawsuits or harassing legal battles in court. So again, I'm trying to understand why this bill is necessary, given Colorado statutes already around late-term abortions, and given the federal government has pretty much already dealt with this.
Dr. Yoest?
I appreciate your concern. I would point to the fact that we do have 30 other states who've passed this kind of legislation, and we're not seeing broad spread abuse of the legislation. I will tell you that, to go back to this point about the difference between the federal law and the state law, it was a surprise to me, frankly, when I heard that a federal law does not apply to a private clinic. So you have private clinics here in Colorado that are not touched by the federal law. It's kind of like an oasis around them. So that's why this legislation is necessary.
Dr. Yoest, it seems to me like if they aren't covered by the federal law, though, they would be covered by some of the other laws on child abuse and that kind of thing that Colorado has. And I know you're from Washington, D.C., but I wasn't sure if you were familiar with those laws.
Well, this bill is written very carefully in order to address a specific problem that we've seen, and we'll hear from someone later in this panel who was born alive after an abortion. And so our experience in looking at the abortion situation because it creates these very unusual situations where the doctor who's presiding over the birth of the child is perhaps not entirely motivated to save the baby's life if it's born, that it's necessary to outline that carefully in the law.
Right. Are there any other questions for our witness? Representative Everett, hello down there.
I need to put on my tie. Thank you,
Yeah,
Madam
I didn't
Chair.
recognize you.
Yeah, exactly, or maybe fluff up my hair. So a lot of times, as we get sort of later into the afternoon, unfortunately, legislators have a hard time processing. Can you kind of paint a picture or give it a good example of when the law would apply?
Dr. Yoest?
One of the things that I mentioned earlier that I haven't heard other people talk about is an unfortunate term that you hear in the context of abortion is from abortion advocates describing something called an accidental birth. Mm-hmm. And that's what this legislation is designed to address, is that when, particularly when you have a late-term situation, there are some babies that just really fight for life. And so, you know, despite all the technology, you just have these situations where a baby maybe, I'm sorry, but comes out too fast, is born quickly. It's just a very rapidly evolving situation. And there's actually a doctor who's going to testify a little later about this. And so I would argue to you that we just need to be really clear as a culture, as a society, that regardless of our differences on abortion as a whole, that there is a really bright line that once the baby is born, that it belongs to the civilization that protects that life.
Representative Conti?
Thank you, Madam Chair. You spoke of a federal clinic being, I'm assuming that means it's federally funded. So would that cover Planned Parenthood?
Dr. Yoest?
That's a really good question. I would think so. I'd have to double check on that.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Representative Everett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And also, I kind of wanted, and I should have asked this as a follow-up question before, about the question that I asked you about the organizations and individuals. So, I mean, in other states, obviously where they passed it, I mean, has this been traditionally bipartisan legislation, or has it always been on a party line vote? Or in your experience, I mean, how has this turned out in the 30-some-odd states that it's passed?
Dr. Yoest?
I can tell you that generally speaking, without speaking to all 30 of them, but generally speaking, this legislation has very broad public and legislative support across party lines.
Representative Singer?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Yoest. So I'm still struggling with, this is the first time that I've heard that this would only, that the federal law would only apply or would not apply for private clinics. Now, my understanding is that public monies aren't allowed to go to abortion services in the first place. And so the other part that I'm a little confused about here is, now I'm reading House Resolution 2175, which I think is the Born Alive Infants Protection Act of 2002. So I don't, is there, am I reading the right federal legislation here? Because I don't see anything that dictates that this, shall or shall not apply to any particular medical clinic, hospital, or anything of that nature. So if I'm reading the wrong thing, let me know and tell me what federal legislation I should be looking at.
Dr. Yoest?
Just that the federal, just that the federal legislation applies at a federal level, and actually, it's. You and I could have a really long conversation about federal money related to abortion. There's a lot of different funding streams, but in terms of the necessity for the law, you do need to have state-based law in order to address a state-based situation, in order to empower your state enforcement personnel.
Representative Singer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So am I reading the right piece of federal legislation here, or is there a separate piece of federal legislation that I should be looking at as a point of reference for this?
Dr. Yoest?
I assume that we're looking at the same piece of legislation. That's just the way that it works structurally and the way that this piece of legislation would work together with that legislation.
Thanks.
All right. Well, hopefully, the weather in Washington, D.C. is going to be better than ours here. Thank you for your
Thank
testimony
you.
today.